Hello everyone! Isang mapagpalayang araw sa ating lahat. Sisimulan ko ang aking talk sa pamamagitan ng isang tanong. I'd like to ask you a question or two. This is my question. Folks, what do you talk about when you come together as a family for dinner or for lunch? Alam ko na increasingly rare na ang pagsasama-sama ng mga pamilya to have dinner or lunch together, especially if you study or you work elsewhere. Pero every time you come together, what do you talk about? Sige nga, isipin ninyo. I have another question. What do you not talk about? You see, ano yung mga hindi nyo pinag-uusapan? You see, for us sociologists, we're interested in what people say, pero we are also interested in what people do not say. Bakit? Kasi doon mo makikita yung mga taboos, or mga tensions, or mga differences. You see, when we talk about religion, or sexuality, or your relationships, or worse, politics, makikita natin that at the dining table, there are differences taking place, not just between you or your brother, but between you and even your parents and even your grandparents. Folks, watch this. To reinforce the gap, we refer to ourselves as millennials, Gen Z, or even Gen Alpha. Usong-uso na yun ngayon. We take pride in belonging to these categories as young people. Generational labels, ladies and gentlemen, like any other group category, gender, for example, they mesmerize us because they are convenient. Madali eh. One or two reasons. First, it's so much easier to explain why a person behaves like this or that because he or she belongs to a category. Of course, ganyan yan mag-isip kasi baby boomer yan. Of course, impatient yan kasi millennial yan. Of course, entitled yan. Ano pa ba ang maaasahan mo sa Gen Z? Right? Or sa Gen Alpha na increasingly nagiging uso na. Those are just very clear essentialists that we deploy on one another at the dining table. Pero there's another reason why these are very convenient labels. We convince ourselves that our generation is so much better. We are woke, and therefore we can change society and politics and the future of our country. So we believe, for example, in the youth vote as a generational choice or even generational power, for example. Naniniwala tayo dyan. Babalikan ko yung point na yan at the end of my talk. So please hold on to that thought. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, the optimism is understandable and even valid. But for this talk, I'd like us to problematize all of that. That's a very common word that we sociologists use, problematize. We want to take a step back and interrogate, tama ba talaga? Useful ba talaga ang mga generational labels na ito? These generational labels, and this is where I'm going to be a little provocative, these generational labels are not only wrong, they are also treacherous. Listen, from a sociological perspective that is aware of the realities of our Philippine society, these generational labels, they conceal more than they reveal. Let me say that again. These generational labels, millennial, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, baby boomer, and so forth, they conceal more than they reveal. Shift gears. So, Dr. Cornelio, Jayeel, how do we define generations pa kung hindi ganyan mga categories na yan? We should not accept them. Well, thank you for asking that question. Too often, we think of generations as age brackets. My friends, these are two different things. No, kunyari, 18 to 25, yung mga 18 to 25 ngayon, you should fall under Gen Z na. Tapos kaming mga mas matatanda, late 20s or up to our 30s, millennials na. No? But unfortunately, these age brackets don't make sense. Hear me out. When you refer to age brackets or the years a person or a group of people are born in, you're not referring to generations. You're referring to cohorts, age cohorts. But think about it. There's nothing meaningful about being born, say, in 2001 or 2005 or 1992. These are just years in the same manner that you say that age is just a number. So, Jayeel, what really matters in defining a generation? Here's the thing. I'll give you sociological perspective. Generations are formed based on shared experiences. Highlight that bit for me. Generations are formed based on shared experiences, ladies and gentlemen. These shared experiences shape our convictions, our behaviors, our preferences, our fashion, our religious views, our attitudes towards life, even our politics. Give you examples. Being born in 1972 does not mean anything. It does not mean anything. But growing up during the martial law does. Kaya meron tayong masasabing martial law generation. People who suffered under the authoritarian rule of Marcos would have a very different political consciousness about democracy and authoritarianism. I-contrast mo yan dun sa mga same generation, pero those who benefited from the martial law, they will be celebratory towards authoritarianism and strongman rule, for example. So dun pala makikita na natin how shared experiences, they shape people's consciousness, but also divide them. Being born, another example, in the 1940s, ladies and gentlemen, does not mean anything, but growing up during the war and its aftermath does. What do your lolos and lolas tell you? When I was growing up, my grandmother would always say, Jay, kumain ka ng gulay. Bakit po? Ayoko pong kumain ng gulay. Simple lang, kapag dumating ang gera, wala kang kakainin. Simple sentence, but if you are keen, and it took me so many years before finally realizing this, na actually galing pala talaga yun. So yung hugot niya ay galing sa karanasan niya, having grown up as an adolescent back in the 1930s and 1940s. Another example, being born in the 1990s or 2000s does not mean anything. But getting educated after EDSA and being taught that you should become who you want to be, pursue your dreams, will set you apart from older generations who never had the privilege of social mobility, digital technology, and greater access to education. Ito naman ngayon, COVID. Some sociologists are saying that the COVID pandemic at a global scale is a generation-defining shared experience. Of course, hindi pa natin masasabi how this is affecting our political and social consciousness. Time will tell. But sociologists are now monitoring how the pandemic is affecting young people, especially all over the world. Maybe something that many of you can consider for your research later on in life. So millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, Jayeel, ano bang problema doon sa mga tanong na yon? You see, ladies and gentlemen, every time we use these labels to define us, we do not realize it, but we are directly importing these categories from Western societies. I cringe, honestly I do, every time I see mga influencers on social media using these categories. Bakit? Kasi these categories, millennials, baby boomers, Gen Alpha, Gen Y, Gen X, Gen Z, whatever, what have you, right? They make sense in the context of North America in particular. After the war, their population grew, their economy expanded. In the 1980s, 1990s, globalization, and then later on, the backlash of globalization, therefore the rise of Donald Trump and the preference for right-wing politics. Tandaan natin that the baby boomers who grew up in the 1960s became later on part of the hippie movement, very countercultural, very anti-Vietnam. Those are historical moments that might seem relevant to us, pero hindi directly affecting us. One way or another, yes, may tama sa atin, pero iba yung naging karanasan natin. Iba yung karanasan natin sa gera, iba yung karanasan natin after the war. Manila was the second worst destroyed city in the world. And iba rin yung paglago ng ating ekonomiya up until now, OFWs, 1970s, 1980s, for example. I'm just citing all these historical moments just to tell you na ibang-iba. Ironically, however, folks, we use these categories in the Philippines. And then, advertisers hijack them. And then we are bombarded with these images. For example, favorite ko to, BGC. No, BGC, when it was launched back in the day, a decade or so ago, ang description sa kanya, home of the passionate minds, home of millennials, passionate minds. Wait a minute, sinong millennial ang tinutukoy ninyo dyan, sir? Sino pong millennial na tinutukoy niyo dyan? At sino po yung passionate na yan? Kahit nga ako na professor, hindi ako makaka-afford ng isang condo or isang property sa BGC. I bet that so many people who work at BGC cannot even afford the lifestyle there at BGC. Kasama rin ba sa mga passionate minds ng BGC, yung mga kabataan na nagtatrabaho sa service sector sa BGC, or hindi sila kasama doon sa conversation ng passionate minds, or security, or personnel, or cleaners, and so on and so forth? Usong-uso rin, no? Nire-report din ng mga HR practitioners. Halimbawa, sabi ng isang news article, here's how the Filipino Gen Z are changing the workplace. Hindi pa nga natin naiintindihan ng millennials. Now we have a new category, Gen Z. And many of us, many of you in the audience right now, I'm sure you describe yourselves as Gen Z. Or merong mga HR practitioners, sasabihin nila how millennials and Gen Z can pursue their passions. May mga articles about that using the latest gadgets. Which is why, ladies and gentlemen, pag inisip talaga natin, pag gumawa tayo ng word cloud about millennials, Gen Z, I think we're gonna come up with very predictable terminologies and ideas and adjectives. Passionate, cosmopolitan, performative, cost-driven, purpose-driven, tax-savvy. Magkakaiba na lang yan sa intensity. Maybe Gen Z are far more purpose-driven than millennials are. No? And then there are claims that for the Gen Z, things are going to get even more exciting, whatever that means. Napaka-celebratory, hindi ba? And even our local psychologists and HR practitioners, they build their programs around these, you got it, normative expectations. Now listen, expectations that, ladies and gentlemen, might be the case, might work if you're from a rich family. Whenever we use these labels in the Philippine context, we are in effect only referring to the affluent among us. And surely, not everyone has the luxury of choice. Sometimes I wonder, ang tinutukoy ba dito mga estudyante ko sa Loyola Heights? See what I meant at the onset? Generational labels, they conceal more than they reveal. They betray the realities on the ground, which brings me to one of my final points. So, Jayeel, what is the state of the youth today? Okay, let's abandon this terminology. Sige nga, Jayeel, describe to me. Describe to us what the state of the youth really is. Well, I'm going to give you a very common, but just the same provocative answer. The reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are all part of a fragmented generation. What do I mean by this? Inequality is real. Inequality is the shared experience that all of us can attest to, can experience, do know. Inequality is evident in terms of income. Sa Twitter, just a week ago, pinag-awayan ito, di ba? A few days ago, 37,000 or 60,000. What's the right wage that young graduates should have? Alam natin that inequality in income exists. Inequality in employment, job mismatch, and even those who are unemployed and underemployed, that's another case. Educational access, ito, now we know that this is a real problem. Just before the pandemic, everybody was talking about Filipino youths as digital natives, tech savvy. But lo and behold, in the middle of the pandemic, hindi pala lahat mayroong access to the internet. Especially if we already in a private school experience this, how much more those in state universities, those who come from very low income backgrounds. Now, to this list, and this is where I am bringing in another sociological perspective, to this list about income and employment and educational access could be added other modes of inequality affecting our youth. I leave it up to you to think of examples. Ethnicity, for example, or geography, urban versus rural divide, or conflict, areas that are whose inequalities are exacerbated by conflict or disaster. Para sa akin, malapit sa puso ko yung realidad ng Bangsamoro, ladies and gentlemen. Bangsamoro is the poorest region in the country with high levels of out-of-school youths and certainly unemployment as well, right? And it's not just geographic, there is an ethnic component, the ethnic dimension to it, certainly even a religious dimension to it. Now I am winding down. Jayeel, are generations useless categories? Are they useless categories? The way these categories have been deployed on us, millennials, Gen Y, Gen X, Gen Z, we use them upon ourselves, but listen carefully. They also serve the interests of the advertising industry, the HR industry, and the business sector. They become how? They become standards against which we measure ourselves. So in the end, they become ideological tools that discipline each of us to behave according to a set of expectations. Watch this. You're either passionate or you're not. You're purpose-driven or you're not. You're adventurous or you're not. These are virtues against which we measure ourselves. It's either you fulfill them or you don't. Also, these virtues are all about the fulfillment of individualistic desires and the exclusion of young people whose choices are so limited. I bet marami sa atin ang nakaka-relate dito. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time that we recognize that young people in the Philippines are far more complex than these categories can offer us. Conflict is a reality. Dysfunctional families are a reality. Violence is a reality. The disasters are a reality. Inequality is a reality in a shared experience that divides us. Therefore, young people are not a homogeneous sector. For every passionate student who graduates from our universities and then works at BGC, there are far more whose dreams are broken and they will remain unfulfilled, most likely because they need to make sacrifices. These are lives that are taken advantage of by the powerful in our midst. Now you understand why I am so passionate about this. What then is our takeaway? Simply describing the youth as adventurous, woke, passionate is negligent, completely negligent of the realities of the majority for whom these characteristics are a privilege. This is a point that we make in our book, my co-authors and I make in our book, Rethinking Filipino Millennials. By the same token, I want you to think about it. You simply asking young people to register for the elections, while it is a noble ambition, is not going to be enough to transform our society. It is not. Bakit? Precisely because there's no such thing as youth vote. Recognizing that we are divided, that's where we should start. In a counterintuitive manner, recognizing that we are divided is what can in fact bring us together. As I leave you now, ladies and gentlemen of all generations, I enjoin you to consider one or two realizations. The first is the reality that we are divided, a point that I have belabored throughout this talk. These generational labels tell us to think of ourselves only and our dreams before we think of other people. But this is not the time to remain divided and focus only on our own ambitions. Finally, we cannot be talking only to people who are like us. Hindi pwedeng tayo-tayo lang. Hindi pwede. We all need to fight for our future, my friends, to be in solidarity with one another, even with the most marginalized among us, is how we make our generation work for our nation. Maraming salamat po, and I hope to hear from you. Thank you.